All right, hi again. Happy Monday or whatever day you are watching this. Episode 96. And today is a big day because we are entering into what is the final section of Second Timothy. And before we get into this conclusion, I think a lot of times we can kind of view the endings of these letters as just something like, hey, Paul's saying goodbye, and then that's kind of it. Maybe he mentions, this dude in that place, but we can just kind of skip over this part. And for some reason, I think we just view these verses as less important to us because they're just at the end. But I want to be as clear as possible right now in saying that these final verses are some of the most profound and richest truths in the entire Bible, especially within this conclusion of Second Timothy. This isn't some shallow or unnecessary study. These are the final words of Paul. These are the last of the last words of Paul, and Paul definitely makes them count. And that's what we'll see right now, so let's get started. Paul tells Timothy, make every effort to come to me quickly. So Timothy needs to rush over to see Paul. He needs to be diligent in that. In the same way that Timothy needed to be diligent to present himself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of God. Well, now Timothy needs to have that same kind of zeal and that same kind of commitment and passion towards seeing Paul. And whenever we zoom out and we look at the larger picture, this is kind of an odd request. Because do you remember where Timothy is right now? Where he's pastoring? Timothy is pastoring at the church. It rhymes with Philippicis, at the church in Ephesus. And we've already talked about how critical and important Ephesus is because Ephesus is a port city. And it's the gateway to all the Gentiles in the Western Roman world. It's basically like an ancient airport. And so if you can secure Ephesus, then the gospel can reach an unbelievable breadth of people. So what in the world could ever be so important for Paul to tell Timothy, temporarily leave Ephesus behind? I mean, if anything, we would expect Paul to say, Timothy, stay in Ephesus, don't leave Ephesus behind. So what exactly is so pressing? I mean, what could ever be so urgent? And remember that question and tuck it away. We will actually answer that question tomorrow. We can't answer it today. I know, I'm sorry. Sorry if you're upset. You just gotta wait one more day. But in the meantime, as we come to verses 10 and following, these are some of my most favorite verses in the Bible because Paul just so vividly explains and highlights what faithfulness looks like and also what faithfulness does not look like. These are the verses where Paul is just as hands-on as he can be. And this is where you and me and where Timothy, where we can look at examples of men who are faithful, but also men who are not faithful and learn the lessons of their lives. And the first lesson that we learn is with Demas. Look at what Paul says. For Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and went to Thessalonica. Demas was a heavy hitter kind of guy. Demas was in Paul's inner circle, and he gets mentioned in places like Colossians 4:14 or Philemon 24. Paul calls Demas his fellow worker. He mentions this guy alongside guys like Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, and Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark. And what we see is Demas started off really well, but he didn't end well. And when Paul says, having loved this present world, it's that Demas seriously deviated from the faith, that he got caught up in the world and all that the world can offer, and he got wrapped up in the culture and all of its pressures and distractions, and all of that led him astray and away from the faith. Demas was a guy that Paul just had close in his heart, and so this hurts. That's why Paul says, has deserted me. This is personal for Paul. He feels betrayed and abandoned. He invested himself into Demas, and Demas repays Paul with heartbreak. And something interesting here is that Paul mentions that Demas went to Thessalonica. We can't be sure, and we can't say for sure why Demas went to Thessalonica. One possibility could be that Thessalonica could have been Demas's hometown, which does seem likely given some, nerdy geography things. But what we do know for certain is that Paul planted a church in Thessalonica. And so maybe Demas, abandoned the faith and then went back to his hometown Thessalonica. Maybe he'll become a threat to the church in Thessalonica, or maybe God will bring him back through the church in Thessalonica. We don't know for sure, but what we do know is that Demas serves as the reminder, not just for Timothy, but also for you and me, is that faithfulness is not guaranteed. Demas wandered off, and so can we. The moment when you think that you are above that is the moment where you become at risk of unfaithfulness. Demas shows us faithfulness is something that we have to fight for. And in contrast to Demas, we need to finish. We will finish with this last verse with these last two guys who do show us faithfulness. Crescens went to Galatia. Titus went to Dalmatia. This is the only time that Crescens is mentioned in the Bible, but Titus is a familiar guy. Paul calls Titus his brother, his partner, his fellow worker. Titus is this source of comfort and joy and encouragement, and eventually Paul places Titus as the pastor over the church in Crete. And this is no small thing, because the island of Crete was the launching point to bring the gospel to Rome. So Titus is a guy who's on the front lines fighting for the faith. And although we don't know anything about Crescens, he's placed alongside Titus. And so it's probably safe to say that Crescens too was this front line type of guy who was incredibly faithful. And both Titus and Crescens, these are guys who are committed. They are devoted. They've been trained, and now they're out in Galatia and Dalmatia. They're training up the next generation, and it's not glamorous. These guys have uprooted their lives, and they have sacrificed so much for Christ, but that is faithfulness. And one last thing that we need to highlight here is the geography of Galatia and of Dalmatia. Galatia is right here, and Dalmatia is all the way over here. And even though they look close on the map, these are super far apart. And what Paul is showing Timothy is that from here, to everything and everyone in between, Timothy, you now have the entire Gentile network of churches. You are responsible for all of that. And although this task, it might seem too great, Paul is reminding Timothy that you have some incredible people to work with. You have leaders who have proved themselves to be faithful time and time again. And now, Timothy, it's your turn. So you need to be faithful. And that is the same charge that we are now left with, that we too need to be faithful.
All right, episode 96, and today we are focusing on that small little phrase, having loved this present world. And Paul's talking about Demas and him abandoning him for the world. So discuss that phrase, and to give you a little nudge along that discussion, go ahead and read 1 John 2, 15 through 17. And that should give you a little bit more context. So that's it for today, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.